Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and I am super excited to be joined by Katie Strang, Senior Investigative Writer for The Athletic. Thanks so much, Katie, for taking the time and coming on. How's it going? How's your summer?
It's been good. It's been chaotic. I have two little kids, and so they keep us on our toes, but it's been busy in the most ideal way. So no complaints.
Why has it been the busy in the most ideal way?
The kids are I'm like basically just like a professional chauffeur, like shuttling my kids to like various different like sports camps and activities. And so we're always on the move, but they're happy and healthy. And so
That's great.
I'm happy.
Awesome. And I want to move from that as best as I can to a bit about your career, Katie. And we always ask a bit about journalists' careers on the show, but obviously you have a different path than most in terms of being an investigative reporter, especially in the sports world. Just tell us a bit about when you first thought you might want to pursue a career in journalism, especially in kind of the game of hockey and in sports as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that started pretty early. I like did this one day job shadow with the editor of um, the sports section of my local newspaper when I was in sixth grade,
Oh, wow.
and just really fell in love with it. And so always wanted to do some sort of journalism, definitely was interested in sports journalism. I came into the investigative element of journalism in a bit of a circuitous fashion, I would say. I started my career at Newsday, which is like one of the big New York tabloids. And so I was doing a lot of general assignment work and, covering various different sports, different teams. I eventually started covering hockey for them. Later went to ESPN, covered hockey and baseball there, and then started at The Athletic about 6 years ago.
And with that,
Yeah, I mean that was really like the first real chance I got to do investigative work, and that was
okay.
part of why I went to The Athletic. Is I really wanted to do investigative work at ESPN. At the time I was doing a lot of like hard news, breaking news reporting, and anytime like there would be any sports story that featured the intersection of sports and the law or sports and law enforcement, I really liked doing that. But ESPN just has like such a deep bench when it comes to
Yeah.
really great qualified investigative reporters. I
Mhm.
knew I didn't have the requisite experience to be able to crack that lineup. So, I mean, that was one of the really appealing things about The Athletic is it was young, it was an upstart. There was a lot of space to kind of carve out your own niche. So it wasn't really until I went there, and the first real like foray I had into investigative journalism was covering the Larry Nassar case for us.
Yeah. And for you, just to backtrack a little bit, what were you drawn to in terms of becoming an investigative reporter? Like, what was the kind of enticement for you?
Yeah, I liked it because I think it requires I think it requires some hustle and requires some creativity. Like it's not, when you cover a game, like you more or less know what to expect and who to talk to and what the processes and protocols are like. And I feel like investigative journalism is a much more inexact science. And it requires, you know, what I would say is a bit more like, dogged journalism and maybe unconventional techniques to track people down or knock on people's doors or, to really like make robust records requests that can yield something substantive. So to me, I think I liked it because it felt very both like challenging and stimulating. And also, I think a big element for that for me was it also felt like very purpose driven work.
Mm.
I mean, I covered baseball for a couple of years and like disclaimer, I don't really like baseball and I didn't love covering it. I wasn't a very good baseball writer. I can tell you that right now.
Okay.
You could read, I mean, like you could read my copy and probably be able to intuit that I did not love covering baseball.
Mm.
But baseball was like super formulaic for me. It was very rote, like it was felt like the same thing every day. It was a ton of travel. It was difficult work-life balance. And I just did not feel like my heart was in like a
Mhm.
Tuesday game against, the Milwaukee Brewers.
Yeah.
So I think once I started tackling subject matter that was sort of more both challenging but intriguing to me, that made me feel better about the quality of my work. And I think it made me a better reporter, because I was so like emotionally invested in doing it
Mhm.
well.
And with that, what are some of the stories? I mean, all of them are, a lot of the stories you put out are so heart-wrenching and purposeful and meaningful. But what are some of the stories that really kind of hit home with you that you find you're very proud of, or really kind of means a lot to you to share that story?
Yeah, I mean, one of the like, I mean, the Nasser, certainly the Nasser case was like really made a lasting impact on me. Both, you know, I learned a lot, I think, about how universities and institutions respond when they're under scrutiny and under duress, and how they sort of reflexively revert to institutional protectionism.
Mm,
Um, I also feel like I learned some like more uplifting things from reporting that case, which is like the power and autonomy that um, people have, and certainly athletes having a more agency now than they did even 5 years ago.
mhm,
And that there's a, a great sort of power and sense of catharsis sometimes, and solidarity that people can siphon, when people collectively come together and speak up.
And with that, like, with all the stories that you've written on, like, what do you think? You've mentioned, alluded to, like, the doggedness, but how do you find sources? How do you interact with the sources? How do you get them to corroborate information? Like, how, give us maybe a little bit of an insight, maybe not on a specific story, but maybe how your process is into kind of digging deep into stories.
Sure, yeah. It's a lot of cold calling on my end. Like I make a lot of cold calls every day. Um and like I always feel like if I get someone on the phone, I have a chance. It's much harder, I think, for people to like ignore you when you just like text them. So it's a lot of cold calls. I think, almost exclusively the stories that I work on now come from tips. So generally like the person that tips me off will do so, because they're motivated to, see this story be told, but they also have generally, a lot of background knowledge about sort of the lay of the land and the internal dynamics of a situation. And so I think like being able to pinpoint someone that can kind of hold your hand and help you parachute into like foreign territory and understand, um, you know, all the different nuances that helps guide your reporting. I mean, that's really important. I think being able to pinpoint who that person is going to be for you and developing a level of like trust
Hmm.
um, with that person is huge. And with every investigation, I try to sort of approach it like a bullseye with like, the principal characters um, in the very middle. And then I work sort of from the periphery all the way in.
Oh, wow.
So, I
Okay.
mean, it can,
Hmm.
some of these projects take months, and like if I'm going to talk to like 50 plus people, that might take a couple months. There have been some stories that I've talked to a couple hundred people for. There are some people that I've only talked to like a dozen for. Um, there are some stories that have taken a couple weeks. There are some stories that I've worked on for years and have never gotten across the finish line. But I'm still very invested in doing so. So there's no like real rhyme or reason. It's like I said, in exact science, and um, you'd like to think that you always like the the labor investment always like pays off in seeing a story come to fruition, and it doesn't. And that's
Hmm.
one frustrating thing about investigative journalism. There's a lot of failure involved.
And so I guess just with that, like, I'm just curious, like, what does that feel like to have a story come out? And then is there kind of this, is that something you kind of learned over time to not maybe get so emotionally involved when the story drops, that it's like the fait complete almost, in terms of.
No, I used to think that actually I used to actually feel like some maybe an hour or two of euphoria of like birthing a big project and like having it be out into the universe. And I used to like enjoy that, like because it would feel like the one time I could kind of just like let down and like
Mhm.
relax. Um, that happens less now because I think now I'm so sort of recalibrated to be thinking as soon as this story drops, like what is going to be my follow-up story? What sort
Mm.
of tips will this story
Wow.
generate? how can I build on this story to like, really take readers through like a more enhanced understanding of this topic? Because that's what big stories generally do. They generally do yield additional, either tips about the topic that you've recently written about or adjacent topics that, you cover in sort of the context of investigative reporting.
How important is it for you to kind of have those additional tips to, in your mind, maybe complete the story to like an nth degree?
Really important. I always like, when we write a story and we hear from someone who we didn't like interview or talk to for a story, and they say like, hey, I just want to let you know that you really like nailed the atmosphere of like what working at this place is like, or what the culture of this team is like, or what this, person who might be abusive, like what their conduct is like. I think that's always like a very affirming thing to hear when you know that you put in the time and work to really like sort of capture, the true makeup of a situation, a dynamic, an institution. So those are really good. And it's just I'm not a great like idea generation person.
Okay.
So I think it was always my goal when I first started doing investigative journalism to be writing about topics enough that it would, yield enough tips to keep me busy. It's kind of like a be careful what you wish for, because it's,
Yeah.
I often now have to like, there are some tips I just like can't even take on, because I'm pretty busy and inundated with tips, but it's been wonderful to have people reach out and be willing to help and to share their story or to guide me to a story that they think is important for the public to know.
And what's it like? Because I find it interesting at The Athletic, like you guys do collabs in terms of reporting. I was talking to you before the show, but I've had Dan Robson and Ian Mendes, and you guys worked on great pieces on Eugene Melnyk and Hockey Canada with the sexual assault allegations. Just what's it like to be in a dynamic where you're investigating with different reporters in different countries, and how does that affect access? Just maybe give us a little bit of an insight into how that whole dynamic is.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Actually, I mean, that's been one of the like
Hmm.
true joys of working at The Athletic, is I've gotten to do so many like collaborative projects with really talented people and people that I really like. And that just, it's pretty isolating to like write critically and comprehensively about difficult subject matter, and it can be nerve-wracking and intimidating to some degree. So I think when you're doing it as a team, you're building in some natural like checks and balances. Like when you're not sure on something, your gut's telling you like, I want to maybe get another source on this, or I don't know if I'm like really articulating this in the way that truly captures it. It's nice to have people to like bounce stuff off of. And then also I always like find it a learning experience, because you know, I'm
Hmm.
I'm reporting on, a story with people that have like different skill sets and strengths than me. So like, just using the Ian and Dan as an example, like Dan is like just a truly like masterful,
Oh,
beautiful, poignant writer.
mhm.
And I'm not.
I
So
don't know
it's,
about that, but yeah.
but it's, like there, it's funny. People, when you're actually like reporting next to someone, you sort of see how they approach interviews and approach people. And like, doing that with Dan made me realize like why people open up to him in the way that they do.
Mhm.
And
Well,
certainly learning about like reporting with your senses, which he's really good about doing, and he's really good about describing time and place, and putting people at ease. And then for Ian, like that was a really cool thing to see how he kind of juggled. um he's been like reporting on an organization for a very long
mhm.
time, so I think it was, I've covered beats but only for like,
Mhm.
a couple years at a time. So to see like the depth of the relationships and sources that he cultivated and like tended to over time, and just like the implicit trust that he, gained with people, I think was really neat to see. And he did some really,
Mhm.
it was when we were reporting the Melnyk story, like, Dan and I were in the background doing a bunch of reporting, but Ian was showing up to the rink every day and having
Yeah.
to do like quite a bit of pushback. And so, that's an incredible like trait to have in a teammate, someone that's willing to sort of like take it on the chin, and still keep moving forward. So that was, I mean, I love those two guys dearly. They're wonderful, wonderful teammates and reporting partners. And I think I'm really proud of the work that we did. And a big part of that is because I enjoyed the collaborative effort of that so much.
Mhm. And with that, I want to go a little bit to the Katie Stone story that you had, because I thought it was so interesting. And if people don't know, it's like the coach at Harvard for decades, and there clearly was a culture of hazing, and there was some racism, and just not, it didn't seem like a great climate. But for you, how much do you think of that culture is just a byproduct of the game of hockey? And what was that like writing kind of about like toxic culture in women's hockey, and how much should we maybe be worried about toxic culture in the game in women's hockey, not just men's hockey?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely pervasive in both men's and women's hockey for sure. If I have like a specialty, it's probably that, I focus a lot of my reporting on sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. Like that's kind of my wheelhouse. And so, I'm certainly not like, I wouldn't say I'm inured to it, but like I am not, I'm pretty used to like dealing with some pretty significant and gnarly
Yeah.
trauma. And I was really blown away at like the scope and the sprawl of the trauma like that Haley and I encountered
Mhm.
when we were reporting that. And it was much more like, it was almost, in some ways I think it took on a very like corrosive quality for people because it was more like psychological and emotional
Yeah.
trauma that was harder to like pinpoint to some degree, for people. And also because, it happened between and amongst teammates, an authority figure that I feel like people didn't necessarily expect to behave in that way. And again, having Haley to work with, Haley does terrific coverage on women's hockey and is just a star and a good friend of mine. That was really wonderful for us to like, I mean, we would like team interview people, like the two of us. And I think we could sort of naturally sense when we would start talking to someone like who would develop maybe a better rapport, who would take the lead. And we got to a point where it felt very natural of like, who would handle what, how we would like sort of approach it. And like, we went to Boston to like report that story. And I think that made a difference too, like, really being able to like set the scene, time and place, and be together while we were doing some of our reporting. I think that really helped the process.
I'm just curious, what do you think you picked up upon with kind of sources or people that you were talking about, where one would be more for Haley? Like, I'm just curious, what do you mean by that?
Well, Haley's a lot younger than me. So,
Yeah.
I mean, some of it is like probably a bit more generational. Some of it was like, people that whoever you're the sort of the first one to build a relationship with, you kind of take the lead on. But like, we both have different personalities too. So I think you can just kind of gauge like which person is vibing better with the
Mhm.
person and just kind of like subtly take the lead from there. But I think, yeah, I mean, when you have a like really strong connection with your fellow reporter, I think you can do that pretty organically. And, Haley and I have worked on other stuff before. We've known each other for a long time. We've been friends for a long time. So that was a pretty seamless process.
And for you, as someone that's an investigative reporter in the game of hockey, like, what do you think about maybe what the onus should maybe be on just general journalists or beat reporters when it comes to matters of abuse and storytelling, in terms of those kind of issues that, sometimes it's like, well, it's not on the ice, so I shouldn't be kind of writing about it. Like, what onus do journalists have in like the Hockey Canada, Katie Stone, like Daryl Sutter, stuff like that, that isn't just um, on the ice performances?
Well, I think when people choose to compartmentalize serious subject matter and sort of like delineate that from the on ice product, I think they're failing to realize that all those things do impact the on ice product. Actually, to me, that's like a very tertiary concern. But when people are not being treated right or treated well, or they're dealing with trauma, like that manifests in a lot of different ways, including their performance. And so I think for people to optimize their performance, they have to feel valued, they have to feel safe, they have to feel supported. And so I think to, sort of eschew that type of reporting just because it doesn't fit into a nice, tidy little box, is leaving a lot of the story untold.
And is that something, to go to one of your pieces with Julian McKenzie, who I've met up and he's great, but just about Daryl Sutter, like, is that something where you find when you're investigating more kind of coaches and how they maybe create a kind of corrosive environment that does affect the on ice product? Like, is that something maybe you saw in the Daryl Sutter piece and maybe other pieces that you've written on?
Yeah, I mean, that one was a little bit different. It was a little bit more straightforward, honestly. It was
Okay.
like, the season went off the rails. Let's do some sort of dissection of how and why it went off the rails. And, I got brought into that project because it had a slightly sensitive element, like kind of within the season's dynamics. And so, we like really tried to simplify it as much as possible, which is like almost take it chronologically and like treat it sort of forensically of
Mhm.
how to really like scrupulously dissect what went wrong, how this like team that had pretty lofty expectations and a lot of talent really underperformed and seemed miserable. And so I think going in with a very clear game plan and also like a really clear timeline, like I mean Julian was great in the sense of like he could pinpoint inflection points of the season and explain the greater context. Haley has like, a lot of experience covering that team as well. So she had relationships, she had context, she had understanding. I knew nothing. Like I was coming into that pretty blind.
Okay.
Um, so I was more like back end support of how to like build the scaffolding of like,
Mm.
an investigative adjacent story. It wasn't truly an investigative story, but just like how to tell a more like nuanced dissection of a season that went amiss.
And with that, just with you and Haley and other women in the hockey industry, like, what's it like for you personally to be in a male dominated industry as a woman? And maybe what advice would you give to young women coming up in either the hockey industry, hockey media industry, or other sports media industries?
Yeah, I mean, I think I used to say like it didn't really like register for me like being a woman in a like
Hmm.
male dominated field. Like now that I'm older, I think I realized that I probably just like put up with a lot of shit that I probably shouldn't have when I was
Yeah.
younger. Um and just kind of treated it as like the cost of admission. I'm much less willing to do that now, and I think most people are much less willing to like give me that type of shit now given the type of subject matter that I generally cover. Um but I would say like one area where I was really, really lucky is I started in New York, and in New York, like there were a lot of women
Mm.
journalists with like prestigious beats and who were kicking ass. And so and who were, some of whom were juggling families. So like I saw kind of the blueprint from a very young age of like people who were doing it and doing it well. And all those people that I saw were also tremendously welcoming and helpful to me. Like there was no territorialism, there was no pettiness. There was just like welcoming and open arms. And so what I would tell like younger women, and I do tell younger women, is like seek out other both women and men in this business, like that you trust, whose work you admire, and just like make make inroads and develop relationships with them, because those are the people that you're going to need when stuff goes sideways, and it will. I always try to like reach out to like younger women journalists to let them know like if there's ever a situation they need to talk through, if they ever need help, that they can come to me, because like I always tell them like I promise you there's nothing you could tell me that would surprise me or I haven't been through or seen or
Mhm.
witnessed in the past.
Hmm. I want to kind of, before I let you go, I just want to go to a quick NHL question, and I'm sure you don't want to be Gary Bettman, but if you were the NHL commissioner for one day, is there a rule that what rule would you change in the game of hockey? Or it can be elsewhere. It can be broader than that if you have something in mind.
Oh, wow. That's that's interesting. Wow, you really stumped me with that one.
That's okay.
I mean, I might change the playoff format
Okay.
to like I love playing games like whenever people do that. I understand that it like de-emphasizes the regular season, but something like that. I mean, I think codifying a sexual assault and domestic violence policy might be a smart idea. I can't think of any like great rule changes. I'm not like I don't care like the shootout. I'm not so much of a purist that the shootout bothers me or anything like that. Um I certainly I would say like I wish there was more stringent discipline in terms of hits to the head because I think that is going to have a very deleterious impact on players for years to come, and I care about player well-being and safety, but I'm probably not the best commissioner for a day. As you can see.
That's okay. I do have one follow-up question kind of about the Hockey Canada, because there is rumors that there will be kind of a report coming from hockey, not from Hockey Canada, from the NHL with regards to what happened in London and the sexual assault allegations. What do you expect from the NHL? Is there anything you know, and what do you think what should be the kind of ramifications or potential penalties for the potential players?
It's really impossible for me to speculate about that. The only thing I would think I would feel comfortable speculating about is that I think it'll come in the next like 6 weeks.
Okay.
I think it'll happen before training camps start for next season. But I can't be positive about that. I think you have a couple different prongs of you have a couple different situations, which is there's an ongoing criminal investigation,
Yeah.
which takes precedent, I think, over like, both the Hockey Canada and the NHL investigation. I don't know whether there's any level of coordination, amongst Hockey Canada, the London Police Service, the NHL. So it's hard to tell exactly what the sequencing will look like, whether there will be charges, if there are not charges, whether there will be supplementary discipline. So unfortunately, like most other people, I'm just sort of waiting
No,
to see.
I just thought I had to ask, just,
Sure. Yeah, no, you should.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Katie, for taking the time and doing this. I just want to give you the floor. Is there anything at the Athletic that you want to plug, or anything that you think we should kind of keep our eyes and ears open for that's coming up soon?
I mean, if anyone has tips, you can always email me.
Okay. I'll do my best. I'm not plugged in as much as many other people, but if I ever have tips, I'll definitely come to you, Katie. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and have a great rest of your summer. I really appreciate it. And you're just an amazing writer and journalist. So I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed that, please like, subscribe, follow everywhere to Behind the Play. It means a lot. We're trying to build this podcast into something. We have a lot of cool guests coming up. So thanks so much for your support, and stay tuned. I will be going to Indonesia in August, so I might have mostly Canada basketball stuff coming up, but stay tuned, and thanks so much for listening, and take care.